In this video, we're going to be talking about physical modeled instruments as they relate to realism. So last week, we spent a lot of time discussing how multi-sampled instruments is really kind of as real as you're going to get. But that may not necessarily be true, and we'll talk about that with physical modeling. And I think the best way to understand this is with a comparison. So to begin, we have a multi-sampled piano here, and we can hear it like so. And it sounds very nice, but I can't easily go in here and change anything about this piano. I can change a few things. For example, I can change the lid position. But this isn't like some kind of a constant control. It's not a slider that I can easily move up and down into a position I like. I just get three options. And what this is telling me is that this instrument has been meticulously sampled at least three times. One time with the lid wide open, one time partially closed, and one time fully closed. But I can't go anywhere in the middle. And so when you think about multi-sampled instruments, okay, the reason some of them are so large in size is because for each state of being the piano is in, they need to go through the same meticulous sampling process. So when I have the lid fully closed, this is a totally different bank of samples to when the lid is open. And the piano more or less stays incredibly realistic. Let's imagine that I didn't have that additional bank of samples available to me, that all I had was this piano in an open position. Would I be able to emulate the sound of a piano that's been closed? Yeah, I could use some kind of a filter to do that. I could use a low pass filter and just get rid of some of the high end. Because that's really all that's happening. This closes it up and it kind of gets muffled, but then it no longer sounds as realistic anymore. It's obvious that it's been affected. So a multi-sampled instrument is really only as good as how many times it's been meticulously sampled in different states of being. Another thing that we don't have access to here is we can't change something like the string length. Right? We're not going to be able to adjust how long or how short this string is and how it would then like resonate up against this body. We can't change the body of the instrument at all. What we see is really what we get. And if this is the sound we want, great. But if we need some kind of fine-tuned control, we're not going to have that. Or if we were to have that, we would need to invest in a better library that's been sampled more meticulously. They've used different microphones at different positions around the room, etc. But for the most part, something like this is going to work. However, if you need to get into the really nitty-gritty and adjust all the physical properties that make this piano sound the way it sounds, then you'd want to try to invest in some kind of really good physical modeled piano. And that's what we're going to be looking at next. We're now looking at a very rare type of plugin, and that is a physical modeled instrument designed to sound realistic, designed to sound as real as possible. And this is the PianoTeq. And so this is supposed to sound just as real as an actual piano without using any samples. So there are some samples that are actually a part of this program, but I think for the most part, those are actually just impulse responses for the convolution reverb. So this plugin, when I downloaded the demo of it, it was like 50 something megabytes. So there have to be samples built into something that's 50 megabytes, but it's not anywhere near the amount of samples that you have in, say, that last Contact instrument that we just looked at, which is gigabytes and gigabytes worth of samples. This is about physically modeling the characteristics of an actual piano and then giving the user control over those different characteristics. And so this is a very, very cool instrument, and we can listen to this, what they call the D4 Grand, and there's a bunch of different instruments in here we can use. Some of them aren't even pianos. They have things like bells, but let's just stick to the piano for now and focus on the realism aspect of this. So if I now go and start playing some notes, I know I'm going to have to turn the volume down a little bit. So it sounds very different to the Maverick, but that's because the Maverick is a totally different design of piano. So let's go in here and grab some other type of piano. Let's go and grab the upright piano here. And what you can see is that for each of these pianos, there is a variety of options on that piano. So for the Grand D4, we could go and choose something like jazz or classical recording. Let's go in and actually grab one of those. Let's grab classical recording for this guy. And so this is the same, I think, basic model. It's the D4, but all of these controls and parameters, or at least a lot of them, have been adjusted to some degree. And so we can listen to this now. And let me turn off that reverb again. And let's then go back and compare that to what we just had, which was the practice version. I'll go forward. Probably be easier to actually do this with A, B. So here's the B. This is the daily practice piano with the effects turned off. And then we'll go over to the classical recording with the effects turned off. So there's a lot of variation that you can get. And one of the knocks on multi-sampled pianos is that if you go in and attempt to adjust the tuning, you're actually using some kind of a repitch stretching algorithm on those samples, which is not going to sound incredibly realistic. Well, if you start with algorithms, you should have no problem adjusting the tuning. It shouldn't actually throw anything out of whack. It should keep the piano sounding as realistic as it's going to sound based on the physical model, but without actually throwing anything off. So if we go in here and elect to use something different, and I'll actually start with equal temperament here using 440 as our reference. This is what you would expect to hear. You know, this is what most instrument is actually, or most music is tuned to, but we'll just go up and play. And then let's switch this over here to well-tempered. So Bach stay. And we'll go back and kind of play some of the same chords here on equal temperament. So you might hear some differences there. What really this would allow us to do, though, is if we were using this in a live performance space, and I don't know why this would ever happen, but we didn't have a real piano, but we had the rest of the orchestra, and they were trying to like tune to something that was historically accurate, you could go in and still get something sounding pretty realistic. Now, we can go through some of these other options as well, like design, for example. We can change things like the impedance on the soundboard. And as you see, when I highlight over this, it gives us a description of what we're going to be adjusting, the physical property we will be adjusting. The greater the soundboard mechanical impedance, the longer the sound becomes. Okay, so this is going to make that board actually shake a little bit more, resonate a little bit more. This is really hard because my MIDI keyboard is actually quite a stretch away from me. You can hear that ringing out. And we can compare that to now if I guess we make something like incredibly stiff, I think would be the idea. So these are all controls that we have and we can easily adjust. And this is just something you could never do with a multi-sampled instrument, right? We don't have these sort of controls. All we have are the samples. So if I want to change something like string length, and this is actually really cool and like something that, you know, a piano maker thinks about to a great deal. If we go with a very long string length, we know that low frequencies are going to come out very pure, okay? Because the string is long enough to actually handle them in their default state. So if I play down low, right? That sounds very natural. If I go and I bring this way down, it's going to really struggle because the string isn't actually long enough to play this back purely. So they have to do some fairly tricky things in order to make this work, but you'll hear the difference. You hear this one's very resonant. And that must be based on some of the other settings with this piano, but... So you just have all sorts of control, and then when you load up different types of pianos, and not just the D4, you can take this obviously a lot further if you want to. So just want to show you some of those things. Let's see if there's anything else just worth quickly highlighting. So this is adjusting the action, so the key action, when you hit the key, right, you have the hammer go up. We can mess with things like damping there. We could look at the mallet bounce itself. I think under voicing here, this actually gives us the hammer hardness. So for example, adjust the hammer hardness at 3 different velocities, blah, 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 blah. The harder the felt, the more brilliant the sound becomes. These were all things that I was talking about before in the presentation. And so we can adjust these various settings here for what's happening at the different velocity layers. So at piano, if I bring this up, I'm actually not even playing it piano, I'm playing it mezzo because that's where you're hearing the change. And then at forte, right, you can do the inverse of what you'd expect. But we could set them all down here. And that's just like really, really cool that you're able to adjust all those things in real time. And so how do you know that something is, for example, a physical modeled instrument? You know based on what the controls are that you're being given. So something like hammer hardness, that is a physical property of the piano, therefore physical modeling. And this one's very straightforward, right? Because we know that this is a physical modeled piano and that all of these things are related to the piano itself. But in some instruments, it might be a little bit more confusing. You know, you might see a control that says resonator, for example. That's a physical property. So that would be a physical modeled element to that instrument. And we'll be looking at that as we move along. The last thing that you have in terms of realism with these physical modeled instruments that you just don't get with samples is the sound recording itself. So this is the output, right? It is coming out. And in this case, we have sound recording, which is going to give us all of these different options here. But we could go back and change that to monophonic or stereophonic or different things. But right here, we now see that we have a microphones set up recording the piano. Okay, so we have a top view, and then we have this front view. And whereas before, we only had those 3 different options, now I could close the lid up. I can open the lid up and we'll hear the difference. It's actually not sounding very different, so I wonder if I'm doing something wrong. Oh, there we go. Okay, now it sounds darker to me. I'm not sure why I didn't before. Maybe it just needed a second to adjust. And we could obviously then go and set this wherever we want. But what makes this instrument fun, and this isn't always necessarily realism, so to speak, is that we can adjust where we place these microphones, or we can go into more of a binaural mode, which would be like, you know, headphones. We should be able to spread this out a little bit. It's about as wide as it goes. And we can now listen to it here. Can make this a very, very wide stereo sounding piano. And this is of course going to sound good to me because I'm on headphones right now. Let's see, what can we actually play that will make some kind of sense? I'm not just going to go and play this, but I just wanted to show you how you can keep the piano sounding very, very real, and you have all these different options on how you'd even want to mic it. You can choose different microphones in here. Okay, so these are some favorite microphones like the U87 and so forth, and we can then move them around and position them however we want. So this goes more into experimental range, and you can see where this is relative, okay? This is now sneaking way off the camera here, and if we put this in a really bizarre spot, we'll hear something like... And if we take the other microphone out to kind of match that, got to grab it from here, bring it down and over. And if I spin this around a little bit more, we're going to get more of like an ambiance here. And we could mic this piano up with as many as 5 different microphones and place them all around the instrument itself. So that is something that you can also do with physical modeling that you really can't get away with on samples. It's based on where you record that microphone, or excuse me, where you record that instrument from. So you could move microphones around to like 10 different spots and then go through the same sort of meticulous sampling process for each and every note at different velocities and so forth. But then you start to talk about like just incredibly large sample size, or just, you know, gigabytes and gigabytes on top of samples, whereas this is like, you know, a 50 megabyte plugin that gives you an unlimited amount of possibilities. So just thought I would go over that with you first. So this is physical modeling as it relates to realism. The one thing that I really wanted to show you that I totally forgot to mention is actually this slider down here on the condition. So this is actually more or less a fun control, but this is certainly not something you could do with samples or a multi-sampled instrument. You couldn't emulate what would happen to that instrument if it was aged over time. You'd have to actually take a piano that's way out of service and resample that, and would it really be worth it? But with this instrument and with physical modeling using some kind of an algorithm, it's very easy. So we can go from mint to worn out, and you'll watch as the interface changes along with it. And if we go to the other extreme, we can see how it kind of changes, and we can then listen to it. So you can hear how it's kind of like gone out of tune, and it sounds a little bit gross. It's really like the strings kind of breaking down and the wood sort of decaying. That's what's being emulated there. And that's just not something you could ever do with samples. The other thing I want to point out, if you just didn't really understand this before, is with the sound recording here, when somebody creates a multi-sampled instrument, they're choosing microphones that they're going to use for that. So it's very difficult for you to then, for example, go in and emulate a different type of microphone being used. That's something we can very easily do here, and you can see the way that the pattern is adjusting. If you watch this first one, this is more of like a cardioid as compared to something that's a little bit more omnidirectional, and you can see the full circle around it. Let's see if we can find something in the figure 8 pattern, right? So you can see this and what the microphone is going to be picking up. And oftentimes with those multi-sampled instruments, the really good ones, you'll be able to choose which microphone you want, but that then requires a whole nother bank of samples to be used. And it takes a really long amount of time to go through and sample that instrument at each key and all the different velocity layers and so forth. So I just wanted to show how with physical modeling, it's very easy for you to get sort of the microphone that you want and have it still sound realistic as compared to maybe later on using some kind of microphone emulation. That's not going to work so well. It's going to sound very unrealistic because the instrument has already been sampled using a particular microphone. So just want to clarify those things, and I hope this has been useful for you.